some nuances in the data there at the normal scale. So what I've done here is I've taken that same data, but I put it on a log scale. And what this allows us to do is to determine the rate of change. And of course, if there was an external impact on the course of the infection curve, it wouldn't only manifest at a peak or a trough. It would actually have an impact at the time that the rate of change occurred. And we can see here, looking at the log scale, that the rate of change is determined from when the line goes from linear to a curve. And what's interesting here, and Michael Levitt has pointed this out back in April, I believe I read this study, is that he was curious that the Gompertz curve for COVID is always decelerating from day one, which would suggest that actually we missed the beginning of it, right? When it actually was increasing exponentially, we missed that, because the point at which we pick up officially recorded COVID deaths, the rate of change is always slowing. Now, if it's always slowing and that deceleration seems to increase around about here, which is mid-February, this predates any behavior change as a result or not as a result of any intervention. So the infection curve is already slowing substantially way before any behavior change could possibly be responsible. We put an extra point on here at the end of February. The government advised for symptomatic self-isolation. Of course, very good logical advice, the kind of activity that people probably would have been doing anyway, as you do. If you're sick with something, you're either so sick you don't want to leave the house, or you don't get in and mix with other people because you don't want to give it to them. So genuinely symptomatic people, whether they thought they had COVID or a bad cold or flu, they would have been keeping themselves to themselves anyway. But even that activity comes so far after the natural deceleration of transmission, and there's no discernible change in that rate of change. We posit that there's nothing unnatural that has affected the course of this virus. We still have some peculiarities that we can examine. So clear now, this linear progression in the log scale shows that mobility change interventions made absolutely no difference whatsoever. This is just a constant deceleration, as we observed in the normal scale chart. But then the only intervention that potentially coincides with a material change in the log scale curve is mandatory masks. And a couple of weeks after masks become mandatory in shops, which is when people are wearing masks more and more, not just in shops, but alone in their cars, out in the streets. Coincidentally, this is when we see a rise in infections that ultimately lead to death. And what makes me really curious about this coincidence is that this rise starts right in the middle of the hottest summer we've had for quite some time, which again is counterintuitive to what we know about viruses of this type. Why should this virus that we maintain was thwarted partly because of community immunity and partly because of season, i.e. the advent of summer, why should fatal infections start to rise from the second week of August? That, for me, requires further in-depth analysis as well. And the only event I have here is universal mask wearing. So that's something that I would be asking a serious question for investigation.